Hi A-Peeps! Welcome to your short set of notes on the ethical guidelines from the American Psychological Association. So we're going to cover the guidelines that were created by the APA. We'll talk a little bit about why, and then I'll give you a nifty acronym to help you memorize these. And then we're going to use these to discuss some of the most infamous experiments in psychology. Okay. So before we get into the specifics of the guidelines, it's important to know why they exist now, and also that they didn't always exist. So historically, there hasn't always been a set of guidelines to protect participants in psychological experiments. So this is something that actually is fairly recent in the scheme of world history. And part of the reason that we have it is experiments like you see here, the Nazi experiments during World War II, the Cold War radiation experiments, and the Tuskegee experiment. And we'll talk about all three of those in just a minute. But basically, after years of unethical research, the American Psychological Association decided to create a set of guidelines or a code of ethics to protect participants in psychological research experiments. So the APA is who sort of started this and created the guidelines, and there's another group that you need to know about called the IRB. The IRB is the Institutional Review Board, and every college has an IRB, and the IRB is in charge of approving research that's going to be done at a specific institution. So they look at your proposal, they look at how you plan to conduct your experiment, and you have to account to them how you're going to follow the guidelines that they have in their code of ethics. So it can be really stressful because it is very intense, but it's intense because you're dealing with live subjects. And so we need to make sure those subjects are safe and protected. So the Code of Ethics was created by the APA in 1953, and it is just a set of strict guidelines that protect participants in experiments. Alright, so before we go into the specific guidelines, I want to tell you some of the history of some of the unethical experiments that led to the creation of this Code of Ethics. So one of the studies that was mentioned was the research of Joseph Mengele. Mengele was a Nazi doctor who worked at Auschwitz during World War II. And he was given sets of twins to experiment on and basically given free rein to do what he wanted. And he conducted experiments on nearly 1,500 sets of twins that were imprisoned at Auschwitz during World War II. And out of those 1,500 sets, only 200 survived his studies. So he became known as the Angel of Death by the prisoners in Auschwitz, because if you were sent to him, you very likely would not be coming back. Another experiment that was done that was considered to be highly unethical was radiation experiments that were conducted in the United States during the time of the Cold War. So during this time, the Atomic Energy Commission conducted over 4,000 secret experiments on unknowing U.S. citizens, and they did this in preparation for a possible nuclear attack during the Cold War. If you remember from your history class, the Cold War, there was a constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and so everyone was scared of radiation poisoning, and this was right after the atomic bomb had first been created, so we didn't know anything about radiation and how it affected the body. The Atomic Energy Commission worked with a few other organizations to do this research. And part of the research was giving children food with radioactive material. They injected hospital patients with plutonium, and they even exhumed bodies of people who had been exposed to radiation without getting permission from the family first. So obviously there's a lot wrong with that. When it came into the public eye later, it was highly scrutinized, obviously. Okay, the last experiment that I'll mention today is one that is very infamous called the Tuskegee experiment. The Tuskegee experiment was conducted in the 1930s for several decades. It began in 1932. And it is a study on syphilis. So in the 1930s, there was no known cure for syphilis, and it was something that a lot of people experienced. So in the United States, there was a study done where basically 600 men were enrolled in the study, and they were coerced into joining because they were promised free medical care. Most of the men that were in this group were sharecroppers at the time. And instead of being treated for their sickness, there were about 300, I think, maybe 400 that had syphilis, and then a control group that did not have syphilis. But instead of receiving treatment, they were given placebos and told that it was medication. And even though local physicians weren't part of the study, the U.S. Public Health Service that was running the study convinced the physicians in these areas not to treat the men so that they could monitor the results. Many of the men died from the syphilis, many went blind, some went insane, and others experienced really severe health problems for the rest of their lives. And as if that wasn't bad enough, some of the men passed their sickness on to their wives and their children. And on top of this, penicillin in the 1940s became a recommended treatment in the United States for syphilis, but these men were not given that treatment. So as you can see, these experiments have a lot of issues. They were conducted under very suspicious circumstances and were conducted in very ethically questionable ways. So after years and years of this going on all over the world, the American Psychological Association decided to create a code of conduct for experiments in the United States. So, you will need to know all of the APA's ethical guidelines, and I have a nifty acronym for you to learn this. It's called DRIP. So, we're going to use this acronym to memorize the APA ethical guidelines that you'll need to know for the AP test. So, it's DDRIPP. So, the first D stands for deception. Basically, the idea here is that there must be limited deception in ethical experimentation. Think about the Tuskegee experiment. Those men were coerced into joining. Did they volunteer? Yes, but did they know what was going on exactly? No. So to be more specific about what this entails, when we talk about deception, participants must not be totally deceived by the experiment. Does this mean we can never have deception in an experiment? No. Sometimes it's necessary. We don't want our participants to know outright everything that we're looking for, or that could bias our results. But we do need to make essential information available to them before they volunteer. So deception is only acceptable when it's absolutely essential to the study, and we still have to tell participants about anything that we deceived them with during the experiment afterward. And this occurs in something called a debrief. So that's our second D. Stands for debrief. Basically, after a study is done, experimenters must debrief with their participants and reveal any relevant information about the research to the participants. So, for example, this is a time where you can correct any misimpressions that might have been created in the experiment. So maybe during the experiment, people were made to believe that one thing was real, and so they have to be debriefed afterwards, and you explain, we told you this was real, but it really wasn't. We were looking for this, and this is why we did it. So that way you can kind of help them to wrap their heads around what they've experienced. And this gives them the chance to know the true aims of the study, and it helps them to be able to, as we would say, leave the way they arrived. So they're not leaving with any kind of damage mentally or physically or emotionally. They can understand what the experience was and why the study was conducted the way that it was. All right, our R stands for right to withdrawal, and this is the idea that participants should be able to remove themselves from the study if they choose. So basically, they have the right to withdraw at any point during the experiment, and they are also told how to do that and how to do that without being harmed. So how to do that safely, because it depends on the conditions of the experiment. There might be times where there has to be something put in place where they can do that safely when they feel the need to withdraw. Sometimes it's really not that high pressure of a situation, but they have the right to drop out at any point. They cannot be forced to stay in the study. All right, our I stands for informed consent. So this idea is that participants should be informed before they can consent to participate in the experiment. What do we mean by that? We mean they need to be informed of any aspects of the study that might influence their decision to participate or not. So their participation must be voluntary, it cannot be forced. And for minors who cannot give written consent because they're not old enough, the experimenter can still study minors, but they have to consistently ask for assent from the minor to continue to proceed throughout the experiment. So they stop incrementally and ask for that assent continuously, and at any point, if that assent is not given, they will stop the experiment. Our first P stands for protection. Protection is from physical harm and also from discomfort. So this could be physical pain, or it could also be mental strain or stress. So participants during an experiment should be managed to protect them from harm. There should be as little risk as possible in the study, and we want to prevent our participants from suffering any long-term negative consequences. And remember, that means anything physical, mental, emotional. We don't want them to be harmed in any way by our experiment. And this kind of ties into that idea of the right to withdraw at any time. And our last P stands for privacy. Privacy is obviously the idea that participants should be given their right to privacy. So this means that when you are publishing your data, you don't share all their personal information. You keep their information private and confidential. So you report your results in a way that doesn't reveal anything personal about the participants, and you cannot, as a researcher, invade their personal lives in any way. So the participants have the right to remain anonymous and to know who's going to be able to see the results of their experiment. So a lot of experiments include testing of some kind, and a lot of participants want to see their own results, see their test results, and they also want to know who else is going to see them, especially when it concerns a sensitive topic. So this is very, very important. All right, so those are the 6 requirements that you need to know for your AP Psych exam when it comes to ethical guidelines. So remember DRIP. All right, and I want you to keep these in mind as you read any psychological studies that we discuss in class. Your next assignment will be to read about some infamous psychological experiments like the ones you heard about at the beginning of these notes, and you are going to be using your knowledge of these 6 guidelines to try to find the flaws in those experiments. So think about DRIP whenever you are looking for ethical issues within an experiment, and use the language that you see here. So talk about informed consent, privacy, debriefing. All right, and be ready to share your thoughts on these unethical experiments. We're going to discuss and debate which of these we believe were the most appalling and why, and we'll talk about specifically what parts of this code of conduct, code of ethics were violated. So I will see you later this week for that discussion and debate. Have a great day. Bye.